All right, good evening, everyone. Welcome you to the next edition of our guest speaker series here at the Holland Land Office Museum. This is now our 6th year of doing this, and we've been growing in numbers ever since, so we're very happy to have everybody here tonight. So tonight we're welcoming back an old friend who's been here several times before, actually once earlier this year, so double dipping this year. Derek Maxfield from GCC, who most of you might know of talking about something related to the Civil War, usually. We're going to vary a little bit in terms of, we're not talking about any generals tonight, so, but he is going to talk about Victorian Deathways of antebellum America, and it's a perfect topic as we've got our cemetery exhibit in the front room, if you haven't been to see that, as it's the 200th anniversary of the historic Batavia Cemetery, which both Derek and I participate in October as well. So without further ado, take it away, sir.
All right. Thank you, Ryan. It's always nice to be back. I have something a little bit special I want to do. So you guys are here at a really good moment. I was hoping my friend Dave Kreutz would be here tonight because I have a special gift for him. And he doesn't know about this yet, so I'm very pleased. About 10 years ago, maybe 8 years ago, I did an interview with Dave about his impression of President Lincoln. At the same time, I interviewed Tom Schobert about his impression of Robert E. Lee, and this was for a book that was going to be published by Southern Illinois Press, which fell through. Not because of anything I did wrong, I will let you know. But I was so disappointed that I made these special interviews, other men too, and I wrote what I thought was a really good essay, and it didn't get published. Well, my friends at Savas Beatty decided for their 10th anniversary that they would publish an expanded version of that essay about living history and reenacting. So it is one of the essays in this brand new book by Savas Beatty, The Civil War and Pop Culture, which is available from Savas Beatty or Amazon. Unfortunately, I don't have any copies to sell to you tonight, but I have one copy from my dear friend Dave, and I wanted to let you know, Dave, how much I appreciated your time for the interview that you gave me, and your patience for waiting for this essay to finally see its way into publication. And later, I will sign this for you. We'll talk.
I'm in a book called Conventional Wisdom now. My pictures are in there, and they televise it out of channel I-24 out of Jerusalem.
Oh.
Me and my penny card, you know.
Okay.
Couple pictures.
Great to know.
Thank you all.
Okay, so on to business at hand, because I have a very strict timeline here. And so what I'm going to do for you tonight is actually half of what I normally present. We're going to do the prior to the Civil War version of this talk. So what we're talking about tonight are Victorian deathways. So if you don't know what deathways are, these are the customs and the rituals largely related to American culture, how we observe death in America. And I know that people are kind of creeped out by this. I hear it all the time. But the thing is the way that we observe death is as important in telling who we are as to the other milestones like marriage or graduations, childbirth, things like this. And it can really teach us a lot about who we are and where we're going. And I don't think really people appreciate, for example, a cemetery. We're celebrating the 200th anniversary of the historic Batavia Cemetery. And these are outdoor museums that are nearly always open. And if we take the time to appreciate the tombstones and the stone carvings, we can pause and say, wow, that tombstone was made 200 years ago by an artist that lived 200 years ago and was trying to say something about death with the symbols that he used, right? It also tells us something about the person buried there, because sometimes they chose the symbol that goes on the tombstone or the epitaph. Sometimes it's their family that chose it for them, right? All of these things say something to us about lasting memory of the person buried there. And so this is what interested me. I'll never forget going to a cemetery when I was in graduate school and standing on a road and looking to both sides of the road. And on the right-hand side of the road were 20th century tombstones. And they all looked alike. They were all fairly low to the ground, rectangular, name and dates on it. They all looked alike. And they looked over here, and here are the 19th century Victorian tombstones. Big ones and small ones, all kinds of different shapes, personalized and individualized, right? All these interesting symbols on them, right? And I stood there and I looked and I thought to myself, my God, what happened here, right? We went from kind of celebrating death in a way, right? Or celebrating the memory of the person that died through these grand memorials to this very, similar to each other, no individualization really except for the names on them. And it took me a while to come to learn that in large measure World War I and especially World War II made us want to forget about death, maybe even deny death. And we certainly didn't want to take the time to recognize death. And a lot had changed in America since the end of the Victorian era. And so I thought, wow, I need to know more about these weird Victorians, right? And what is it that they're trying to say here? So that's the origin of what I'm going to be talking about tonight. But before I dive too deep into Deathways, we really have to understand who the Victorians are. And I'm sorry if I'm going too fast, but Ryan will have to stick out ready to pull me the minute we cross 8 o'clock. Right?
Well, maybe a little later.
Okay. So, the Victorians. This is a group of people that few of us understand, despite the fact that so much of what they did to us remains in our culture in ways that we just don't appreciate. I'll just give you a couple examples. How many of you have seen or insisted yourself on a white wedding dress for you, yourself, or your daughter? White wedding dress. That's tradition. That came from the Victorians. When we say somebody is resting in peace, that came from the Victorians. Right? There's a lot of things that the Victorians did that have lasted. Other things we have rejected. But what they did for American Deathways, I think, is absolutely, utterly fascinating. But let's start with, we're talking about our middle-class Americans, Protestant, Anglo-Saxon heritage, usually, all right? There was a southern version of Victorianism that had a strong sense of honor. That was something that will contribute to the creation of the Civil War later, all right? That sense of honor among southern Victorians did not exist so much in northern Victorians. But for the most part, what I'm about to say about Victorians applied to them all right? So, middle class. Now, this new middle class emerges in America after the Industrial Revolution of the 1820s, sometimes called the Transportation Revolution. This is when we began the canal building era, including the Erie Canal, and other new transportation networks. This is the era when Robert Fulton invented the steamboat and then made it a commercial enterprise, changing the way that we transported goods on rivers like the Ohio and the Mississippi pretty dramatically. We started manufacturing, textile manufacturing in New England, and then other manufacturing after the War of 1812, and this began to create this new middle-ish class. People with a little bit more money, they owned their own home, and they had a little bit of affluence. Some of them on the upper scale of that had serious money. And as time goes on, this middle class will expand and expand and become quite large. But you see, these people that were part of this middle class in America decided that they wanted to create kind of their own class consciousness. They wanted to create what they thought was kind of an exclusive club where some people qualified to be in the club, but they made a whole lot of rules to make sure fakers didn't make it in. And boy, did they enforce those rules too, as we'll see. Another thing about these Victorians, strong sense of morality underpins the whole thing. And this goes back to where the name comes from. I'm sure some of you recognize the name Victoria. The name comes from the Queen of England. There was a Victorian era in Great Britain, and it preceded ours by a little bit, and we did take the name from what was happening there. But Victorianism in America and Victorianism in Great Britain kind of grow apart as time goes on. There are some commonalities, and one of them is this strong sense of morality. To give you the basic story here about Queen Victoria, she came to the throne as a young woman. She was about 20 years old when she came to the throne. She was unmarried. There was an intense amount of pressure on her to get married because they wanted to solidify the throne, right? And you pass the throne to the next generation, right? And so this was very important. And to some extent, Queen Victoria was pressed into a marriage with her cousin, Albert. Her cousin Albert was from Germany. This was kind of an arranged marriage, but also they did come to have a serious love affair over time. Very serious love affair. So this worked out very well for them after a little time, after they both kind of get used to this. But one of the things that Queen Victoria in England had to get used to was that he brought from Germany a strong sense of morality, a strong sense of ethics that was foreign to the British court. And boy, when he started to insist upon a new code of morality for the court and for the royal family, did he meet resistance, even from his wife. But over time, he wins the fight. Because his wife adopts it, and then she insists on it in court, and then the whole thing begins to spread through the English aristocracy down to the rest of English society. So this is how that enters Victorian Britain. Here, it was a little bit different. Ours largely comes from the Second Great Awakening. Now, if you're not familiar with the Second Great Awakening, this was a strong religious movement. In the 1820s and 30s, it begins. This area that we live in here, the corridor between Rochester and Buffalo, came to be known as the Burned-Over District as a result of the intense revival activity in this very area, in Batavia, in Buffalo, and in Rochester. The revivals were so frequent and so fervent that people got burnt out from them. And that's where the name comes from. This amount of religious frenzy and activity in this area instills morality. It is a religious movement. And part of it was the sense of millennialism. Millennialism was the idea of evangelicals at the time that we could bring on the second coming of Christ. We could do it. And we would do that by perfecting this world. And once we had perfected this world, the second coming would occur. We would all get to heaven that much faster. This was a prominent idea in the Second Great Awakening. And it caused people to be a little puritanical, and it caused people to be really zealous about religion. And so this sense of morality digs in. It could be very irritating to those not friendly to these ideas, though. People were followed into their homes by some religious zealots in this very area, as the one person tries to save the soul of the other, But one of the things that comes out of this is a new reform movement in America, a new reform movement. And so to perfect this world, you might do things like reform prisons, reform insane asylums, the temperance movement, the abolitionist movement, the women's rights movement. I could go on and on, but those are some of the big ones. All of these new reform movements were born out of the Second Great Awakening, and most of them led by Victorian women. Most of them led by Victorian women. Now that doesn't mean that everything goes their way, because women didn't get the right to vote in the 19th century, right? The abolitionist movement will split over ideas about women's rights, and there are other implications too. But this strong moral underpinning was part of what it meant to be Victorian. And this will hold on, and in fact, after the Civil War, there'll be a strong resurgence of evangelical activity. We won't get the time to do that. Now, a few other things about the Victorians. So, they were very romantic. This was the romantic period in American history. And if you study American literature, it's also called the Romantic Era in American literature. So these things kind of go together. Well, the Victorians were experts at romanticism. They could romanticize anything, even death, as we'll see. They are also highly sentimental in ways that we would not recognize today, or we might find kind of icky, When you combine that intense romantic outlook, I mean, really, everybody looking through rose-colored glasses, with this intense sentimental spirit, it creates something kind of interesting that today it would be very foreign to us. Now, I know that some of you, like me, might be in the same house with your wife or your husband and text each other from one part of the house to the other. I do that, and I'm guilty of that. But at this time, they wrote letters to each other. Hand wrote long, long letters to each other. And one to a son might start with, "My dearest boy, I don't think you know just how much your father loves and adores you. I care so much for your well-being." And it would go on in this flowery, romantic language, right? And a lot of guys today would just, but that's the way they were. It was a letter-writing society at the time, These things will play heavily into what happens with their attitudes toward death. There was one other thing I should mention. They had something called the cult of domesticity that we can't skip over. The cult of domesticity was about gender roles in America. And among Victorians, there was this idea that women should stay in the home and men should go out and work. Now you might say, "Professor, wait a second. That sounds like the 1950s thing." It does on the surface. I was raised by 50s parents, so I'm very familiar with that idea. But the reasons were different. And that's the key to understanding the difference between gender roles in the Victorian era and gender roles in the 1950s. Because you see, in the Victorian era, women were the head of the household. Absolutely. Women wore the pants in the family. They made all the buying decisions, and their husbands had to toe the line. That always gave giggles if I let it settle in. Because in the 1950s, it's just the opposite, right? The men are absolutely in charge. They make all the most important decisions. Women should be submissive and quiet, right? That's the 50s thing. But see, the reason for this is during the Victorian era, they had a belief that women were morally pure. They were born morally pure. And that moral purity was an asset to the family that had to be protected at all costs. And so the reason women stayed at home and raised the children and took care of the home was to protect that moral purity. Because if you send women out into the workplace or into the political sphere, that moral purity is going to get compromised. And that's such an important family asset, you can't let that happen. So Victorians believed women were the head of the family. They especially were the moral rulers of the family and society. They made all the social rules, and they made all of the decisions when it came to the family itself. Buying decisions, how to raise the children, all of that, because they were informed by this moral purity. So women were not kept in the household because men were trying to keep them down or something. They stayed in the household because they wanted to protect that moral purity. Now men, you send them out in the business and political world because everybody knows men are already corrupt. This is what they believe. Men are already corrupt. They're given to temptation. Everybody understands that. You send them out there. Now they're going to get corrupted more, there's no doubt about that, but it is the job of the wife to redeem him. It is the job of the wife to use that moral purity to redeem him, to keep him on the straight and narrow, to reclaim him, strip away that corruption, and then when he goes out again, the whole process starts all over. But better to send him out to be corrupted, a man already given to temptation and corruption, than to send her out and compromise that moral asset. Everybody with me? I know this is kind of complicated stuff, but this is the picture of the Victorians, and it plays into why they look at death the way they do. All right, onward. So over time, one of the ways that the Victorians protect the club is by making rules. Oh, so many rules the Victorians make, all with an eye to protecting membership in the club, because they don't want any pretenders coming in. No pretenders. So if you're working class, you might aspire to be Victorian someday, own your own home, and the whole 9 yards. You got to be able to follow all the rules to be really considered Victorian. On the other hand, this also keeps those snotty rich out of the club too. Now the rich, of course, they've got the money to do anything they want, but one of the things the Victorians introduced is this refined sense of not just morality, but manners. And many of the rich had their own code of manners and ethics that they were attuned to. And so social pressure over time keeps the working class and the poor aspiring to become Victorian on the one hand, and the rich struggling all century long to be respectable like the Victorians, on the other hand, to preserve their own social identity too. And it gets very complex after the Civil War. Now, I mentioned the revivals of the early 19th century. The Second Great Awakening creates many of the conditions underpinning what the Victorians are all about. The rules are propagated through society through women's journals. So in our century, in the 1950s, this was a thing too. I remember my mother reading Good Housekeeping and things like that, magazines. And if you think about it, and if you read them, because I've examined these, not that I really wanted to, but I want to see, is it the same kind of, it is kind of the same thing, right? Because they're talking to you, they're giving you advice about cooking, they're giving you advice about cleaning, they're giving you advice about how to do the laundry properly, right? Hasn't changed all that much in that way. But so far as rules are concerned, not so much in the 20th century. Now, in the 20th century, it's all about the advertisers being able to sell you the right soap, right? In the Victorian period, they're laying down rules because if you're fully Victorian, you've got to be able to afford to follow the rules. And the leading rule book was the Genesee Ladies' Book. You see, this one is from 1860, but this was the premier ladies' journal. And if you were a Victorian lady, the last thing you wanted was for you or your family to get caught off guard, not staying in tune with the rules. Because if you were in a public place and you were dressed the wrong way and you weren't in tune with the rules, your whole social status could come crumbling down. You could be blackballed. This would be a travesty to the family, right? So you didn't want this to happen, so you really did stay attuned to the journals. Ladies were in charge of this. Following the rules to the letter. Keeping your family attuned to the new rules, right? It was a lot of stress, and it was expensive to follow the rules. The fashion rules alone were ridiculous. But it was all part of their plan to keep the club exclusive. Because if you can't afford all the right fashion, then you can't be part of the club. But this is why some Victorian women had to change their clothes 6 or 8 times a day. Because the rules were different for every season. The rules were different for every time of day. The rules were different for every occasion, right? So if it's spring and you're going to a wedding and the wedding's in the afternoon, it's got to be this way. But if it's a winter wedding and it's in the morning, then you got to follow this rule, right? It could get really complex and quite crazy. And like I told you, some of this hangs on. How many of you heard the rule, you're not supposed to wear white after Labor Day? Well, who do you suppose invented that idea? And yet, we still somehow tend to follow some of this stuff. you know, even though it sounds kind of ridiculous in some ways. Now, let's get to some of the death stuff, because I love the death stuff. The way that they observe death and celebrate death is going to change over time, both because of the club that they're trying to keep, but because of sensibilities too, right? As I said, they're romantic and they're sentimental, and some things don't work for them anymore. So one example of this is the old-fashioned coffin. So before the Civil War, if you're going to get buried, it's going to be in a coffin. There's not caskets yet or other options. It's going to be shaped like this. You've probably seen Halloween props like this, right? Because it's got that classic shape where you kind of see the shoulders or the elbows sticking out there because it comes out at the sides. You know what I'm talking about? It's a very iconic shape, isn't it? But the problem with that is it's not romantic at all, you know. It suggests the shape of the body. And the Victorians really got a little squeamish about that, and it doesn't keep in tune with the romance, right? And so they are going to press change, you know. Now some of that change isn't fully developed for a while. There'll be change in coffin forms over time. And after the Civil War, we see the rise of caskets. If you go to a funeral today, calling hours, and you see a burial device, it's a casket. It's a rectangular shaped casket. That name, by the way, didn't always mean burial device. It was a jewelry box, the name of a jewelry box, that they adopted for this use, because after all, what do you keep in a jewelry box? Your dearest valuables, right? One of the things that happens in the 19th century is there comes to be a new cemetery movement called the rural cemetery movement. And what this meant was they wanted to reinvent what a cemetery was. And cemeteries in the early part of the 19th century were generally associated with churches. They weren't independent things on their own generally. They were always church yards or adjacent to a church yard. And even in the rural areas. Now in the cities, it becomes something of a problem because of crowding. There were places in New York and Philadelphia, for example, that started to follow European standards where you buried bodies 3 deep in a grave. And every 7 years there'd be a rotation where the bottom body, by now the casket's fallen in, you collect the bones, you move everybody down one spot, and you make a new burial on the top. Well, that was thought to be unhealthy, you know. And so they said, well, we got this overcrowding problem, you know, and these cemeteries, they're old and decrepit, they don't look nice, they're not very romantic after all, right? So these sensibilities that the Victorians have changed their minds about what burial should be like. But boy, let me tell you, their sensibilities were really challenged by a couple of things. One, body snatching. Colleges training physicians would pay quietly, no questions asked, for a body because they needed to train physicians on anatomy, and that was the only way to get a cadaver, you know. But for the Victorians, that was just horrifying, you know. The grandma might get pulled out of her grave and nobody would know the difference, right? But another thing was even more alarming, and that was when they started to move cemeteries during this time from city cemeteries that were overcrowded, or they're moving a village cemetery into a new cemetery. One of the ones that comes to mind is what is in Medina. So there is a neighborhood in Medina where there's a playground that's not really in use much anymore. I forget the name of the street it's on. That's an old cemetery. And there are bodies still there, by the way. They don't want people to know. There are still bodies there. But they moved all the bodies they could try to find over to Boxwood Cemetery, you know. But the problem is when you do that, when you're moving an entire cemetery, you want to be cognizant of the feelings of families, right? Because people are going to be squeamish to begin with if you're moving a whole cemetery. And they want some assurances that their loved ones are going to be treated with respect, right? So there were rules about what happens here. So if you find a casket that's broken down and just bones, You're expected to put it in a new coffin, seal it, chronicle the inventory, and move it carefully into a new grave, right? Or if the coffin is partly broken down, same thing. Take an inventory of the contents, collect all that you can, put it in a new device, a new coffin, move it with respect. Does this sound reasonable? Okay. Well, one of the problems was, in some cases, they found claw marks on the inside of the lid.
Oh,
Yeah. They had been burying people alive. And so they would find corpses with bloody fingernails and splinters, and they had suffocated. They'd come to and suffocated in the grave. And part of the problem for this is our medical knowledge in the early 19th century just wasn't great. We didn't understand things like coma or other conditions that would create a very shallow pulse, right? And back then, we were putting people in the ground within hours of death. We were. If they were pronounced dead by anybody, they were in the ground within hours because people were deathly afraid of decomposition and how that might contaminate the living. And so only really the Irish and the Scots did wakes. But in the wake of this, I didn't mean to do that. In the wake of this, more American society, mainstream American society, begins to hold wakes with the purpose of watching the body for 24 hours to really make sure that grandma is gone, right? And even then after 24 hours, they developed ways to make really sure, like taking a needle and shoving it under a nail, smoke enemas, things like this, to really double check that the body was in fact dead.
If they're alive, that's one hell of a wake-up call.
Yeah, well, they wanted to be really sure, and so they changed the way that they do things, right? But they also wanted to create kind of some safety mechanisms too, to catch the grave robber or to give grandma a chance to actually get out of her grave if she wakes up alive. And there are a slew of new patents that came out in the 1830s, 40s, and 50s for all these different ideas to save somebody if they're buried alive, or, in case of a grave robber, there's a booby trap that's going to catch them, But a lot of them never really work out very well. One of them was this device where there's a tube that goes in the ground and you can't see it, but there's a rope that they place in the hand of the corpse, and the corpse begins moving, the rope moves, and a bell goes off and a flag goes up. But I can tell you, you'll all understand this. This does not work out because of teenage boys. Do I really need to say any more than that? So this doesn't work out at all. But there are some other devices you can find in this very area that work for that same reason. I'm thinking about, I think, Lakeview Cemetery in Brockport. You can see in the side of the hill, they build mausoleums sometimes. You guys probably know what I'm talking about. But there's also safety chutes. So you might see a grave with an oval, and it's a big metal plate, just enough room for the coffin to be put into the side of the hill. And their name is on the metal plate. But what you don't know is there's a latch on the inside, and just before they put the person in there, they actually loosen the lid. They loosen the lid so that the person can climb out. If they find their way to the hatch, you can pull the latch and they can actually get out of the grave that way. Now, to my knowledge, nothing like this has ever happened, but these things are around and we can find them if we really look. All right. Now, getting back to the cemetery thing, we see the rise of the rural cemetery movement in America. The rural cemetery movement is about reimagining our cemeteries. And what I'm talking about here is going from the churchyard, which is row after row of graves, to something beautiful and park-like, something romantic, right? And so they start to design garden cemeteries. And the first one was at Mount Auburn in Cambridge, Massachusetts. Now, has anybody here ever been to Mount Auburn? Okay, good. But that's my daughter. I spent maybe a little too much time in cemeteries. This is gorgeous. Gorgeous. This was the first, but you guys are kind of lucky in some ways because there are three prominent ones in this very area. So, Forest Lawn, you're very familiar with that one. Mount Hope was one of the earliest, actually. Mount Hope was the third, or maybe the fourth, garden cemetery ever. I got married in Mount Hope Cemetery. And Mount Albion is a beautiful example of one of these rural cemeteries. And they all have a lot of things in common. They're beautifully landscaped, rolling hills, often ponds, and back at that time, picnic tables and benches, because the idea was, it's like going to the park, only you're going to commune with grandma. You can have a picnic right next to her grave. They didn't think anything was weird about this. They thought it was just a celebration, and there you are communing with nature and your dearly departed in this beautiful, peaceful setting at the same time. So I'm just going to show you quickly some examples. This is from Mount Auburn Cemetery in Massachusetts. You know, the paths, the beautiful landscaping. Willow trees are one of the signature iconic symbols used by the Victorians in death. You'll see willow trees very prominent on tombstones from the Victorian era. You know, if you see one on a tombstone, that's a Victorian stone. Wow. This is a beautiful pond there. So these become really a hot thing. And of course, many of these are still around today. Many people appreciate them today. And even though when I tell people that I got married in Mount Hope Cemetery, they're like, wow, that's really, really strange. Actually, there's 8 to 10 marriages in Mount Hope Cemetery a year. So I'm not the only weirdo out there, you know. But this pattern in our reimagining of cemeteries hasn't gone away. It hasn't gone away. And even if you look at 20th century cemeteries, they have been highly affected by this outlook. Now, changes in tombstone art also reflects these new Victorian sensibilities. Now, some of you might be aware, though we don't have any in this area, of Puritan stones. Puritans were Calvinists. These are from New England. And if you look at Puritan tombstones, they have skulls on them very often. Death's heads, things of this nature that's meant to remind you that you're going to die someday. Memento mori, right? You're next. Get ready, you know? And they were scary and stark. But by the time we get to the early 1800s, things are changing. Things are softening up. Things are starting to get more beautiful in cemetery art too. And so you see, this is very late. This one, I don't know. I see fangs on this. I don't know. You tell me, am I imagining that? Because that's super creepy. I mean, vampire tombstones? Here is a Victorian stone. The hand holding flowers, a very popular device. You'll probably see this in many Victorian pieces of art. The urn and the willow tree, probably the most famous of the Victorian devices. And there are many, many others. If I had more time, you know, I could go through dozens and dozens of these. But really, if you look at a tombstone and it's kind of beautiful and a little sentimental and a little sad, that's probably a Victorian stone. And of course, the death date will tell you, you know, Victorianism ends kind of abruptly in about 1820 or 1920. So Victorians in America run from about 1840 down to 1920, right? Now, Victorians really valued a good death. They wanted a good death for everybody, a right death for everybody. They were so serious about a good death that the ladies' journals carried scripts and how-to manuals for death. They put out special issues on how to conduct a funeral to put on a good death, right? They're very concerned about this. And so they would make rules about, all right, so if the person is within 48 hours of death, you think, this is who's allowed into the room, this is the color of the drapes, this is the color of the curtains, this is how the dying person should be dressed at that time. Now, if you're within about 24 hours of that person's death, now they got to change their clothes because they have to be wearing this color. The color of drapes is going to have to be changed now. If you're within half a day of death, now you have to start putting out the black crepe in your parlor, in your home to signify death. You got to be ready for this when it comes, and so you need to be on top of this. And they had all the rules about where the crepe should be hung, how you, as the mother of the dying or the wife of the dying, how you should be dressed within 12 hours of the death of your husband, 6 hours of the death of your husband, right? More or less. And then who's allowed in the room at what time in the proximity to death, and scripts that you should try to memorize if at all possible, because if you're going to have a good death, then you have to say the right thing at the right time. They even made scripts for the dying person. So it's not bad enough that you're dying, but now you got to memorize your lines. Ugh. But that's how serious the Victorians were, and how uptight they were that everybody gets a good death. And oftentimes these scripts were couched in this flowery, sentimental, highly Christian language, right? So that you could later not have regrets about what you said and when. They were very uptight about this. And funerals were even more highly scripted. And you can see this in the literature of the 19th century. Uncle Tom's Cabin and the death of little Eva is one of the more famous. But if you look at the literature of the 19th century, wow, are there a lot of deathbed scenes? Well, that is reflecting what Victorians are up to. Deathbeds. This is the most sacred of sacred times for a family, gathering around the person departing, right? And so this was very, very important to them, and you can see it in the literature, you can see it in the things that they offer families to buy, you know, all through the culture. Victorian full mourning. Somebody that is in full mourning is expected to wear widow's weeds and to be in black head to toe. And so if you're a widow and you just lost your husband, you're going to have black gloves up to your elbows. You're going to have a full veil over your face. You're going to have widow's weeds, which is kind of a crepe that you drape over yourself. See, she's pulled back her veil, right? It would be covering her face for the first week after her husband's death. Anytime she was in public. Black shoes, black petticoat, just head to toe in black. And she was expected to use mourning stationery. Now you have a set of mourning stationery here, don't you?
I think so.
Yeah. You know that it's mourning stationery because there's a big black border around the outside of the stationery. And as time goes on, the black border shrinks. So if you're a new widow, it's a big 2-inch border. And after a year, it's only 1 inch now. But a widow was expected to be in mourning for 2 full years. And the last of the black wouldn't go away for 2 full years. Again, this was prescribed in the ladies' journals of the time. They also, as I said, were very sentimental. They were so sentimental that they wanted mementos of the dead. And if you go to an antique show today and you ask an antique dealer for hair jewelry, I am betting you'll find some. Because this was so widespread in the 19th century that there's a lot of it still around. Now, the whole idea of hair jewelry is when your loved one dies, you give them a haircut, and then you hand out snippets of hair to the people at the funeral. You get some, and you get some, and you get some. Everybody gets a little sprig of the hair. Of course, the corpse is bald by this time, but, nobody's going to see that anyway, right? And they were expected, at very minimum, to put a little ribbon around it and put it in an envelope, right? But if you are immediate family, you're expected to put it in a locket or a ring or make jewelry out of it. And so hair jewelry was just all the thing. So this is, you braid it, you put it inside a ring or a locket. This is not only hair inside the locket, but the necklace itself is braided human hair. You have a hair wreath here too, don't you?
Yeah, we've got a few pieces of jewelry as well.
Yeah, ask Ryan to see it. It's really interesting stuff. Though, in the past, I have had family that have told me I wasn't allowed to have any of it because it was just too creepy. Now, the Mexican War in the 1840s really changed Victorian sensibility, really challenged Victorian sensibilities. because in the Mexican War, a lot of young men never came home. It was very important to a good death to actually have the body and to have a funeral, to have the snippets of hair, right? But a lot of these young men that go off to Mexico, you can't bring a body back from Mexico because there is no embalming yet. And so all those young men are buried in Mexico, right? Wow, did Victorian families have trouble with this? And it leads to changes in American deathways from the demand that results from it. And the most famous of these is a new burial device called the Fisk metallic casket, or burial case. Now, this is all about trying to bring a body back from a long distance and preserve it long enough for a family to see at least the face. The idea was it's all made of metal, and you can use a pump to pull all the oxygen out of it, and then you seal it with cement. So the body inside the metallic case, in theory, will not decompose because there's no oxygen inside the case to lead to the decomposition of the body. This was flawed from the start because of something called anaerobic bacteria, but they didn't know about that yet, and so they had no idea that this was going to lead to some grim things that they didn't anticipate. Another problem with the Fisk metallic case is so heavy. It's 600 pounds before you put a body in it. So transporting it is going to be really expensive. Buying it from the start is going to be really expensive. So this really was available more to the upper end of the Victorian range and to the rich. But the whole metallic case thing only lasts about a decade anyway because it never pans out. But it's fascinating for what it looks like.
Was it made out of iron?
They are made of heavy metal, right? So here is an ad for it. You get an idea of what it looks like. See, the date is 1850. They gave free ones to famous people that died at the time as a way to advertise it, you know. John C. Calhoun, for example, was buried in a Fisk metallic case. And here is a child's version, because I wanted you to see what this really looked like. Now, this really reflects Victorian sentiments in interesting ways. So, do you see the elbows anymore? It's not the shape of the coffin that of an earlier time. Things are changing. It's supposed to be a bit beautiful. Now, what you see here in that wrapping is supposed to be a shroud. Bodies were often buried in a winding sheet or a shroud in the 19th century. This one, it's of course all metal, but it looks like a shroud, and notice the lace. Only really rich people are going to be buried in a shroud with that much lace, right? And you see there's flowers and vines down here, and kind of the shape of the body is gone, though, you know, to us, that it screams mummy a little bit, I think. But you can see they're adapting, right? Culture is influencing what they want. Now this is what would be over the face, all right? So the idea is you transport the body over a long period, or a long distance, right? And you can be assured that the very minimum is you can see the face of your dearly departed. All right, you're not going to be able to open up the case, but you'll at least be able to see the face. What you do is you remove the faceplate, right? And see how beautiful the faceplate is, right? You've got a widow, you got the weeping willow, right? All these Victorian devices, that's just so pretty and nice. Then you remove the faceplate, and there's a window. You can see the face of your dearly departed. Yay. That helps with a good death. Only anaerobic bacteria cause decomposition anyway. And almost every time when you take off the faceplate, what you see is heavy condensation on the inside of the window and a face that you probably don't recognize. Very sad when you spent that much money to be able to say goodbye to the dearly departed. So these had a lot of problems, and they go away pretty quick, but they say a lot to us about Victorian values at the time. And there are adult versions there. Now, what's going to happen is the Fisk case is going to go away, and they are going to transition to caskets eventually. But as a kind of halfway between the two you see this. The shape is somewhere in between. Now, it doesn't show a shroud anymore. You do have a big window over the body, but this is not advertised as a way of preserving the body. And there's one from a museum in Texas. You get the idea, right? They also marketed all kinds of devices during this period that were advertised to try to preserve a body before embalming became a thing. And you probably know that embalming came about just before the American Civil War, really caught on during the war, but it was mostly affordable to officers, you know. And early embalming was a little sketchy anyway. Sometimes con men are involved in this business, but it evolves over time to professional morticians by the end of the 19th century. The Civil War, like nothing else, challenged American deathways. We were totally unprepared for the Civil War in almost every way, North and South. You'll recall that both sides thought that this was going to be a short, bloodless war. There might be one battle, but since God was on their side, they would win for sure. That was the idea. And so, romantic notions that Victorians carried had a strong role in volunteering. Because serving in the war was thought to be something highly romantic, and they used the language, this romantic language, to press young men into the service, right? You know, and they talked about glory and earning immortal renown, and they used this kind of language about, you know, lonely death on the battlefield. There's nothing better you could do for your country. How romantic and wonderful, right? Well, this romance drove young men into the ranks because they thought war and death were going to be beautiful things. But remember that the Civil War is the first war in America that's photographed. And so the carnage could not be hidden for long. And the death toll hits everybody. Remember, at least 750,000 casualties, we believe now, from the American Civil War. It touched everybody. Touched everybody. And romantic notions about death go away by the time we get to 1870. The Civil War changes our notions of death and dying and the way that we observe death very dramatically. And I will stop there and be happy to take any questions. Ryan, I did it in under an hour.
Beautiful.
Thank you. Yeah.
One question that I have, I think it was on your second or third picture. It had John Henry, and I couldn't read what John Henry, the word after John Henry.
It was the dash.
It was in the Victorian, where you showed the different, the people, the way they were dressed. Right there.
John Henry Yates.
John Henry what?
Yates.
Oh, was that the name of a person or the
It was with the context from the slide I stole it from.
Okay. All right.
What's the symbolism of the willow trees?
The willow tree looks sad, doesn't it? The willow looks sad. And so that touch of sadness that surrounds death is really illustrated in the way that the tree looks. And so it makes the perfect device for Victorians. It's beautiful because of nature, but it also looks sad. It's that
Oh,
simple.
okay.
Yeah.
Thank you. Makes
Yeah.
sense.
Yeah, the lyrics and the titles for some of the songs during the Civil War, you know, after the Battle Mother and
Right? If you look their song, they're all sad and lonely, right?
oh, weeping, sad and lonely.
Yeah. Yeah.
What was the life of the Blue Bloods, you know, like beginning to the end, the Blue Bloods, is that still, you know, the terminology, Blue Bloods?
So blue bloods historically is associated with nobility, right? In America, if you're talking about blue bloods, you're probably talking about the ultra rich, right? After the Civil War, with the rise of the Gilded Age, and we get the Rockefellers and the Carnegies and people like that, they were thought to be American aristocracy and thus the blue bloods of America.
They had strict codes about intermarriage and such, right?
Oh, they did. But I didn't have time. You see, this is a 2.5-hour presentation beginning to end that takes us all the way down to 1920. You know, I'd be happy to come on a return engagement and continue the story sometime, but, you know, for tonight, we got through the Civil War. Any other thoughts? Yes?
So I just was going to ask you, I see that you're scheduled in December at the college, correct?
Oh, I have a talk in
Oh,
November.
I'm sorry, November. Is-
College, that's about spiritualism.
That's entirely different than this, okay. I
Well,
wanted to check and see, well,
Almost entirely different, but related. The whole spiritualism movement is tied to Second Great Awakening and to Victorian culture in very interesting ways. But again, that in itself is like a 2-hour.
okay.
you know.
I just wanted to make sure it wasn't this, you know, I want to see if it was different.
No, and I'm going to get you in on exclusive information here, hasn't been announced publicly. The Morgan Manning House in Brockport, we're doing a special exhibit on spiritualism in the Victorian world, October 23rd through the 25th. It's a free exhibit. My students are going to be intimately involved, and you'll move through an exhibit created by my students. And on Wednesday night, I'm giving a special lecture on spiritualism in America to cap off the whole exhibit thing.
Is it like a Halloween time?
Yeah, well. But you can tell I love this stuff, so, you know, I'm happy to do it.
What was the degree of seances and such, you know?
Oh, yeah, seances were a big part of spiritualism, you know, really a centerpiece. We're not going to try to do one at the Morgan Manning House, you know, people would object to that probably. But the whole idea that you could communicate with the dead is a brand new idea in the 19th century. And there's a lot of interesting influences behind it, including the Second Great Awakening. Ryan, do I have time to do an hour on spiritualism here, just to give them a preview?
You know, maybe another time we could do that one. Then you could really get into it, so.
I would need 2 hours to get into it
Well,
then.
we could always.
You'd pull the plug after the first hour.
Are you going to continue on with the trappings of the funerals?
I'm sorry, what was
Are you
that?
going to continue on with the trappings of the funerals as the ages go on? Because like in the 40s, I remember in Buffalo, people were in the home and they had black over the doors.
Yeah, that stuff is left over from the
Are
Victorians.
you going to continue on with that information, or would that ever be another, where you would continue on to that?
I could very easily talk about American Deathways down to today if I had enough time. But Ryan would have to commit to a 10-hour program, you know, over 4 nights probably.
Yeah,
I
it'd
was
be a
very young,
multi-night engagement.
But I can remember the black over
Yeah,
and people
yeah.
were in the house.
Some of that hangs around down to today.
It's just,
Okay.
it's just wonderful. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much. Thank you all for coming.
Well, thank you again, Derek, for that wonderful presentation. If you'd like, we always hang around for a few minutes. You can check out the exhibit out in the front room about the Batavia Cemetery, where we do have some hair art as well as mourning dresses and things like that that Derek was talking about. Just a quick PSA of some upcoming events. Tuesday night,
Years and years ago.
here at the museum, in collaboration with the Chamber of Commerce, we'll be doing a free talk on the upcoming solar eclipse
Have you ever seen that?
with Dan Schneiderman from the Rochester Museum of Science.
This is great.
Our next trivia is a week from today at 7 o'clock. It'll be on the Mayflower. So for anybody with the ancestry going back to the Pilgrims, might be interesting. Then we've got our next guest speaker 2 weeks from today. Be Joseph Van Remmen on how Buffalo got its name. A lot of theories out there, and
That's where I'm going to sign it.
Mr. Van Remmen has one that might be the real one. So, and then to wrap up the month, the 28th, we have our next Java with Joe, which will be on John C. Gardner, the most famous author from Batavia area.
Awesome.
And then the 29th is the first of 2 West Side Batavia ghost stories.
Yes,
And
I
then
do.
our ghost walks will
He's
be
gonna
every
sign-
Friday
he's gonna dress up
in
as
October.
Theodore Roosevelt over that.
A lot coming up. Oh, and our murder mystery is back, our murder mystery dinner theater, October 14th at Batavia Country Club. You can ask me about all that information, but it's a good time. We have a program based on the Rowell murders, which will be sort of played out, and you get a really nice meal in the process too. So, a lot coming up. So you can find everything on the website or Facebook, or just give me a call and I'll tell you. So